Red shorts, black sunglasses, red jacket, attitude. The girl's a time bomb. Armitage III. When I think back to my early days in anime fandom, I always end up thinking about Armitage. It just seemed to always be around. The tapes were at Suncoast, the ads were in magazines, and Armitage herself even managed to get her own American-made action figure at one point. That's right. At the time, for me at least, it felt like this anime was in the same ballpark as some of the other greats of that time period like Tenchi, Sailor Moon, and Evangelion. But over the years, Armitage just seemed to kinda fade away. It never seems to come up in conversation when people are talking about the best 90s anime, and Armitage herself never enters the conversation when people are arguing over who the best 90s waifu is. That's bizarre because she is the 90s anime waifu in so many ways. So since this franchise just turned 30 years old, let's dive into it and try to figure out who cares about Armitage III. But before we even do that, which Armitage experience are we looking at today and what's it all about? Well, today we're jumping into where it all began, the original 4-episode OVA series that started to get released in February of 1995. There's also a summary kind of remixed version of this that was released as a movie, and of course we're going to touch on that later. There's even a sequel to that movie that's a little bit unfortunate, but today we are really going to concentrate on the original OVA series because it's the best. So why mess with the rest? And with all that out of the way, hopefully you're on the edge of your seat wondering what this franchise is all about. It takes place in the not so distant cyberpunk future of 2046. Mars is a place that you can go and live now, so we join the big guy cop Ross on his adventure to become the ultimate Sailor Mars fanboy by moving there. Pretty soon, things get a little bit crazy after he shows up, country music gets destroyed forever, and we finally meet the robot best girl of every neckbeard's dream, Armitage. She's assigned to be Ross's new partner, and she just so happens to be a third, hence the name of the series. So what's a third, you might ask? Well, a third is a robot, which is bad for Ross since he seems to not like robots.
What a loser!
Since his last partner was ended by one. Anyway, they end up chasing the same bad guy for the next couple of episodes. A bunch of thirds get destroyed. We learn that when thirds go to heaven, they all just hang out naked all the time. There's some pretty cool action parts. Armitage and Ross eventually hook up, and then it's over. Yeah, I think that pretty much summarizes the plot of Armitage. There's also some themes of discrimination and the possibility of some anti-feminism under the surface. However, it seems to present these themes in a negative light, which is great because these are negative things in the world, of course. But I watched this show when I was a young weeb and just thought it was a cool action show. So today, we are going to channel young Kimchi and just take this show at its surface level. Well, that probably sounds like a pretty good, if not somewhat stereotypical, mid-90s OVA. So you would think that people would eat that up in the modern era of nostalgia and retro worship. But it doesn't seem like that's the path that Armitage has taken. Of course, there are tons of OVAs from the 90s that time forgot, but Armitage is different because there was a push behind this show, at least in America. Pioneer released this thing in the US pretty close to the original Japanese release date, which was very impressive at the time. The first OVA came out in Japan on February 25th, 1995, and the US met Armitage on March 29th, 1995. That was pretty impressive at the time considering many shows came out years or even decades after their original release at that point. So yeah, Pioneer wanted this thing to come out in America so that people could meet their new robot girlfriend and live happily ever after. So while the OVA seemed successful enough on its own, Pioneer really wanted more for this show. They had stars in their eyes and money in their bank account. Once all 4 episodes were out in the wild, it was time to do some edits and turn this thing into a movie, complete with a brand new English dub with famous Hollywood stars like Elizabeth Berkley and Kiefer Sutherland for some reason. And thus, Armitage III Polymatrix was born. Yeah, Pioneer really released this thing with an all-new dub as a movie with less content than the original, and they thought that they would not only cultivate a brand new audience, but also please the existing audience that just shelled out a pretty decent amount of money to see the same story over 4 tapes, except those 4 tapes had more content. Sure, They did make a few edits and changes to the story, but it was basically just an inferior version of the OVA series at the end of the day. I'm not even saying that the movie is bad by any means, it just seems like a waste of time. But I guess it seemed like an okay idea to somebody, because it happened. At that point, anime was starting to gain some attention in America, but the over-the-top movies geared towards mature audiences were the only things really gaining any traction and acclaim. Ghost in the Shell, Ninja Scroll, Akira. These were the movies that were doing pretty well, and Pioneer wanted a taste of that. They even set their sights on getting this glorified AMV into theaters across the country, which makes me think at least one person on staff thought that this was going to be bigger than the entire Star Wars trilogy and Purple Rain combined. It was going to be Armitage mania all over the place. Michael Jackson would soon be breaking down the doors to record a tribute song to his new obsession. There was going to be an entire theme park dedicated to Armitage with fully functional thirds running every ride. This was going to be a revolution. This was going to change everything about the entire anime industry and then the entire world. Everyone needed to get ready now. Come on, America. Armitage is here. So, did it succeed? Well, they did get it on the Sci-Fi Channel at least.
Next.
This is the Martian Police Department, Detective Syllabus. Did you have a nice trip?
Ross Syllabus is a cop from Chicago on a new assignment.
Tell me, is that crazy getup you're wearing a standard issue Martian police uniform?
Just learn to live with it.
Life on Mars can get complicated.
Robots are disguising themselves as humans. It's my duty to do something about this.
The battle between man and computer is coming to a terrifying conclusion.
If humans don't want me, then why did they create me?
Featuring the voices of Elizabeth Berkley and Kiefer Sutherland.
Don't do it!
Armitage III, next on the Sci-Fi Channel.
Yeah, this not so radically remixed robot of a movie about robots didn't really do a ton for the franchise or humankind as we know it. I mean, I did discover this movie when it aired on Saturday Anime on the Sci-Fi Channel, which influenced me to check out the OVAs, of course, and I'm sure that happened to a lot of people. But Pioneer wanted more. And Saturday Anime played OVAs all the time anyway, that it just kind of put together as a movie and seemed like it was a lot less work the way they did it. So yeah, that was not the goal of this thing, to get it on the Sci-Fi Channel. There were much more aspirational goals, and they did not reach them at all with this thing. But that being said, this utterly weird move had way worse implications than just the movie failing, because I think this is a big part of the reason that people got tired of Armitage so quick and ended up forgetting about Armitage altogether. While this little OVA was great for what it was, I think a lot of people were disappointed by the hype surrounding the movie, because that's all it was, hype. It was a good OVA for sure, and some people like myself would even argue that it's a great OVA. But thanks to the movie not only underperforming, but under-delivering, eventually, even the OVA started to get forgotten about by most people, and when something gets forgotten about, it fades away. And that's unfortunate, because that seems to be what has happened to this show. If the movie had never existed, would this OVA have went on to be one of those legendary OVAs? Probably not, but I don't know, maybe it could have got a sequel in its original format or something. There might be other reasons that that never happened. I'm not an expert on this series by any means, but it just feels like more could have been possible, at least for the legacy of the franchise. Plus, we haven't even touched on that sequel movie that came out years later, but I'll just cut to the chase. It's not great, so that couldn't have left a good taste in many people's mouths, and we probably wouldn't have got that without the movie, so having the original OVA by itself just feels like it would have been a better move all around. Is the original series flawed? Oh yes. The animation can be great, but at times it can be janky. The story starts out fairly strong, but it gets kind of messy towards the end. While Armitage herself is an amazing leading lady, most of the other characters are just kind of forgettable. That is to say, while I think this is an essential part of 90s anime media, not everyone feels that way. And while I might disagree, I get it. If you only have an hour to try to get someone into anime from this era, you're probably not choosing Armitage. But is that such a bad thing? There is value in being the underdog. When this anime was a little bit newer, you would hear people complain about how the movie version was unnecessary or that the sequel movie that came out years later was just awful, but people generally seemed to like the original OVA. However, as time progresses, oftentimes franchises that are just considered okay or good get lost to the sands of time. No one will ever forget the essentials from an era, and no one will ever forget the worst of the worst. However, if you're somewhere in the middle, you risk becoming obsolete, which is somehow strangely poetic for a cyberpunk classic like this. In many people's eyes, Armitage is obsolete. Now, media and nostalgia for said media moves in cycles, so who knows? Maybe one day this thing will rise above some of the other forgotten anime from its era and become hugely successful, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. For me, the real story of Armitage will always be a story of what could have been. What would have happened if this remix movie had been the huge success that they so desperately wanted it to be? Could Armitage have been a huge pop cultural icon? Could she have been bigger than Goku? Could she have been bigger than Pikachu? Could she have been bigger than Fred Durst? I mean, it was the 90s. He was pretty big. We may never know the answers to these important and potentially life-changing questions, but we can enjoy Armitage for what it was and what it is. A great piece of 90s anime nostalgia that deserves more attention than it gets. But the real question remains, who cares about Armitage III? Well, I care, and I would say at least some people that were getting into anime in the 90s and early 2000s still care. Past that, I will admit that it has to be hit or miss with more misses as to who even knows this thing exists at all, because it seems to be all but forgotten in the modern era. And that's too bad, because there's a lot of otaku joy to be had here. So if you've never seen this great little OVA, I would recommend checking it out. Armitage herself pretty much carries the entire series, but maybe you'll like some of the other characters as well. Like the city. The city it takes place in is a great character. We are going to consider the city a character this time. And if you still love Armitage to this day, you're one of the real ones. And it's good to see that there's a few of us left 30 years after this series was originally released. And with all that being said, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to Armitage for being a great 90s anime waifu robot girl with a leather jacket, cool sunglasses, and enough energy to play in some band that had to have opened for the Donnas at some point. Regardless of how this anime is remembered by the community at large, you will always have a place in all of our hearts, Armitage. And that's what really matters at the end of the day. You might not be Mad Bull 34, but at least you tried.